The day the glass ceiling shattered. San Francisco International Airport basked in the amber glow of early morning sunlight. The light poured through the vast glass walls of the terminal, illuminating the polished floors and creating reflections that stretched like delicate fingers across the space. The travelers seemed to flow in every direction, each one engaged in their own preoccupation, their minds tethered to destinations, boarding passes, or thoughts of homecoming. There were hurried goodbyes, tight embraces, and a subtle tension of anticipation in the air, a shared, unspoken understanding that air travel was never simple. It was always an event. Among these travelers walked Elaine Monroe, though she wasn't quite like the others. She wasn't part of the typical crowd you might see bustling around a major international airport. Her presence was distinctive, commanding attention as she walked, not out of ostentation but out of an inherent confidence. There was an energy about her, a kind of magnetic aura that made her stand out in any room. She wasn't simply another person heading to her flight. Elaine was the newly appointed CEO of one of the largest airlines in the country, a role she had earned after years of breaking down barriers in an industry that often seemed impenetrable. Elaine's journey had been a series of triumphs against the odds, one after another. Born into a working-class family, she had fought for every opportunity, every advancement, often in spaces that didn't expect a woman, much less a black woman, to succeed. But she had proven them all wrong, time and again. From her early days as a junior analyst in the airline's corporate office to now leading it from the top, she had cultivated an iron will and a relentless desire to succeed. Her success wasn't just about career progression, it was about proving that the very people who'd once been overlooked, underestimated, or even outright ignored could rise to the highest of heights. Today was supposed to be a moment of reflection, a quiet celebration of how far she had come. As she moved through the terminal towards the VIP lounge, there was a sense of accomplishment that accompanied her every step. She felt the weight of the title, CEO, settle upon her shoulders as if it were a mantle she had earned. The crisp burgundy suit she wore reflected not only the wealth of experience she had gained but the exacting standards she held for herself. The gold accents on her lapels, the subtle gleam of the buttons, and the sharpness of her appearance were all part of the image she had crafted over the years. It wasn't vanity. It was a statement, a quiet defiance against the world that had told her no for so long. The VIP lounge stood in stark contrast to the rest of the terminal. It was quieter, more refined, the soft murmur of conversations punctuated by the faint clink of glassware. As she approached the lounge, she was met with respectful nods from the staff behind the counter, a recognition that she had earned the right to be there. Elaine's stride never wavered as she made her way toward the door. She wasn't here as a passenger or as an outsider. She was home, this was her domain now. But as she reached for the handle to open the door, the situation took an unexpected turn. A flight manager, standing just inside the lounge's entrance, looked up from his desk. His eyes flicked to her first-class ticket in his hand, a glance so brief it might have been mistaken for a casual oversight. But there was something else in his gaze, a subtle shift in his demeanor. His eyes narrowed as he processed her presence, and for a split second, Elaine felt a weight settle upon her, the kind that comes when someone makes a judgment without fully understanding the circumstances. "Excuse me," the flight manager said, his voice initially polite, but his tone carrying an air of condescension. "This is a VIP lounge for our premium passengers. I'll need to verify your credentials." Elaine froze, her hand still hovering inches from the door. She didn't quite understand at first. Was this man looking at her as though she didn't belong? A fleeting sense of confusion passed through her, followed by an immediate surge of disbelief. She had expected many things on this day, people offering congratulations, a moment of quiet reflection. She had not expected this. "I believe you have my ticket," Elaine responded, keeping her voice steady. There was no reason for him to doubt her. No reason at all. She was the CEO of this airline. She held the power to open any door she wished, not just metaphorically, but literally. And yet here she was, standing outside the very lounge she had access to, as if she were a guest who needed to prove herself. The manager glanced down at the ticket again, his expression still unreadable. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I cannot let you through without confirming your eligibility." "I'm sorry, but these are the rules." Elaine's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a matter of a clerical error. No, this was something deeper. She could feel the familiar weight of racism, the subtle, almost invisible barrier that had always been present in the back of her mind, lurking behind every advancement, every promotion, every achievement. She glanced down at her hands, which were steady, her fingers curling slightly into fists. She was calm, too calm, but inside, she was seething. Did this man not know who she was? Did he not recognize the power that her first-class ticket represented? Did he really believe she was some imposter? "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice now tinged with an edge of authority she had perfected over years of negotiating, of handling situations like this with cool precision. "I'm the CEO of this airline. I don't need to explain myself to you, nor do I need to justify my presence here." But the manager's response was not one of recognition or apology. Instead, he held up the ticket once more, giving it another cursory look as if he was unsure of whether to let her in or not. His eyes flicked up to her again, and in that brief moment, she saw the judgment there. "Sorry, ma'am. I'm afraid I can't let you through." Elaine took a slow, deliberate step back. Her gaze didn't waver from his face. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her expression remained as unreadable as ever. She could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on her, the weight of everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, all of it colliding in this single, insignificant interaction. As she turned away, her eyes scanning the terminal briefly before focusing on the exit, a thought surged within her: "I won't just let this go." She was done letting things slide. The time for silence had long passed. And so, with one final glance over her shoulder, she walked away, her resolve hardening with every step. The flight manager, still standing in the doorway of the lounge, had no idea who he had just crossed paths with. 6 minutes later, his career would come crashing down. But what would follow, what would unfold in the weeks ahead, would be nothing short of extraordinary. It would shake the very foundation of the airline, rippling through every corner of the company, igniting a firestorm of controversy, and ultimately setting the stage for a battle no one saw coming. Elaine Monroe had just begun to fight back. The aftermath of an unseen battle. As Elaine Monroe stepped into the cool air outside San Francisco International Airport, her thoughts spun in a whirlwind of disbelief and fury. She had expected many things today: praise, congratulations, perhaps even a celebratory quiet moment, but certainly not this. She had just encountered the kind of subtle but insidious prejudice that still permeated the world she had worked so hard to rise above. And it had come from someone who, by all accounts, should have recognized her. As she slid into the back seat of her car, the weight of the moment began to settle in, the anger she had initially pushed aside bubbling up to the surface. She knew it was more than just the denial of entry. It wasn't just about a mistaken glance at her first-class ticket. It was about what that moment represented: the dismissal of everything she had worked for, the assumption that she didn't belong, the unseen but ever-present barrier that sought to keep people like her in their place. "Ma'am, are you okay?" the driver asked tentatively as he glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. Elaine nodded, though her mind was far away from the mundane concerns of the day. "Just take me to the office," she said, her voice firm. She couldn't afford to dwell on it for too long, though the sting remained fresh. Inside the sleek back seat of the car, Elaine replayed the interaction over and over in her mind. It felt almost surreal, as though it had been a scene from someone else's life. The anger, the disbelief, the way the manager had looked at her like she was an outsider, every detail felt deeply personal. And yet, she knew she wasn't the first person to experience such treatment. Her frustration ran deeper than the incident itself. It was a culmination of years of experiences, the kind of microaggressions that piled up and weighed down even the most determined soul. But there was something else that gnawed at her. She was no longer just an employee. She was the CEO, and this wasn't just a one-time slight. This was a signal that the old guard hadn't fully moved on. The company had advanced in some areas, but in others, the status quo was still clinging to the past. The flight manager's assumption had been rooted not just in a lack of respect for her position, but also in the ignorance of the systems that allowed such thinking to persist. By the time the car arrived at her office, Elaine had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. This would not be brushed aside as a simple mistake. She would make sure that the airline understood the implications of what had happened. She would confront it head-on, and not just with words, but with actions. Inside her office, Elaine closed the door behind her and stood for a long moment, allowing the silence to envelop her. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office was breathtaking, but today, it didn't bring her the comfort it usually did. She knew she had to act quickly. This was an opportunity to push for change, a change that extended beyond her personal experience and into the very fabric of the company. Picking up the phone, Elaine dialed the number for her assistant, whose voice came through quickly. "Yes, Ms. Monroe?" the assistant asked, a note of concern in her voice. "I need you to schedule a meeting with the board," Elaine replied, her tone sharp. "And I need it to be first thing tomorrow. Make sure it's with the entire group." "Understood, Ms. Monroe," came the quick response. Elaine hung up, her eyes drifting to the sleek mahogany desk in front of her. The room was impeccable, the polished surfaces and high-end finishes exuding a sense of power. She had worked hard to reach this point, but moments like this reminded her that the fight for true equality wasn't over. She would need to go beyond the traditional channels, make sure the board understood the gravity of the situation, and take the opportunity to push for systemic change. It was no longer just about one flight manager. It was about making the company a place where all people, no matter their race, gender, or background, could thrive. The next morning, Elaine entered the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she made her way to the head of the table. The board members, all white men in their 50s and 60s, shifted in their seats as they looked up at her. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her, as if wondering whether she would come to the table with some watered-down response or if she would address the issue with the authority they were not accustomed to seeing from someone in her position. Elaine didn't bother with pleasantries. She didn't need to. She had earned her seat at this table, and today, she would make sure that they understood why. "I'm here to discuss something that is far bigger than an isolated incident. Yesterday, I was denied entry to the VIP lounge of our airport. Not by accident, but because one of our flight managers assumed I didn't belong," Elaine began, her voice calm but resolute. "This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This is an example of the deeply entrenched biases that still exist in this company." The room was quiet, each member of the board turning their attention to her. It was clear they hadn't expected this. In the silence that followed, she continued. "We have a culture here that has allowed assumptions like these to persist. And while this may seem like a small thing, it's indicative of a larger problem that I am no longer willing to ignore. If we are truly going to be a leader in the industry, we need to address these issues at every level. We need to ensure that our policies, our training programs, and our hiring practices reflect the values we claim to uphold." One of the board members, Richard Graves, the chairman, shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Elaine, we understand your frustration, but we also need to be mindful of the bigger picture. You've only been with the company for a short while, and we're in the midst of restructuring. This incident doesn't warrant the kind of attention you're giving it. It's a matter of protocol, not race." Elaine's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. The dismissiveness in Richard's voice was not new. She had seen it before, heard it in subtle ways when other executives spoke. They thought that because she was a newcomer, she didn't understand the inner workings of the company, or worse, that she was too emotional to deal with such issues. "I'm not here to make an emotional plea," Elaine said, her voice steady and cold. "I'm here because I see the potential for real change. The kind of change that can set us apart from our competitors. But it starts with taking an honest look at our own shortcomings. And that begins with leadership that doesn't tolerate systemic bias and doesn't ignore the reality of discrimination. If we want to be the airline of the future, we need to confront the issues that are holding us back today." She let the silence hang in the air, watching the board members as they processed her words. It wasn't just about addressing the flight manager's actions anymore. This was about confronting the very foundation of the company's culture, which had allowed such ignorance to fester in the first place. Richard Graves finally spoke up again, his voice cautious but now tinged with a hint of realization. "We understand, Elaine. But what do you propose we do about it?" Elaine met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I want a full review of our diversity and inclusion initiatives, and I want it to be transparent. I want a company-wide training program on unconscious bias, not just for the frontline employees but for every single person in this building. And I want the flight manager who denied me entry to be held accountable for his actions. We need to make sure that the policies we put in place don't just exist on paper, but that they are reflected in the way we operate every day." The room was still. There was no quick response, no immediate agreement. But Elaine could see the shift in their faces, the realization that they were not in control of this conversation. She had taken the first step toward real change. And in doing so, she had not just challenged one man's assumption. She had challenged an entire system, and she wasn't about to back down. The winds of change. Elaine Monroe left the boardroom with a sense of quiet satisfaction, the weight of her words settling deeply within her. She had stood her ground, unapologetically pushing for the change she knew the company desperately needed. It wasn't the first time she'd had to make people uncomfortable, but this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something that could shape the future of not just the airline, but the entire industry. Outside her office, the halls of the corporate headquarters seemed to buzz with a different energy. People glanced at her as she passed, and some offered small nods, almost as if they could sense that something significant had just transpired. It was as if the walls of the building itself could feel the momentum she had just set into motion. But despite the satisfaction of taking control of the conversation, the reality of the task ahead began to settle in. Change wasn't going to come easily, and the challenges she would face in the coming weeks would test her resolve in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Elaine took a deep breath as she entered her office, the familiar hum of the city outside the window offering little comfort. She didn't allow herself to rest too long. The room, with its polished wood and sleek furniture, felt a bit too cold at that moment. She could almost hear the clock ticking in the background, the sound of time marching on as the stakes continued to rise. Her assistant, Maria, knocked softly and entered with a briefcase in hand. "Ms. Monroe, I've arranged the meetings you requested. The board has already sent over the materials for the diversity review, and the heads of HR and corporate training are waiting to speak with you this afternoon," Maria said, her voice low but eager. Elaine nodded, her mind already turning over the details. "Good. Let's make sure we get this right. The airline's leadership has been stuck in its old ways for too long. We need to move fast, but we need to be thorough." Maria hesitated for a moment, before speaking up. "The board members didn't seem pleased with your approach, Ms. Monroe. They're used to doing things the way they've always been done." Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know. But that's exactly why we need change. You can't keep things running the same way and expect different results. The biases that have been allowed to run unchecked within this company, those aren't just mistakes. They're part of a system that needs to be overhauled." Maria nodded and hesitated again, before adding, "And, what about the flight manager? You said you wanted him to be held accountable." Elaine's gaze shifted to the window, her mind flashing back to the moment at the airport when the manager had refused her entry to the lounge. It was an image that replayed in her mind, like a cruel loop. A man had looked at her and assumed she didn't belong. He had decided, without even knowing her name, without a second thought, that she was out of place. "I'm not letting that go," Elaine said, her voice cold and steady. "He can't just get away with something like that. We'll address it during the review process. If he's unwilling or unable to follow company policy, he'll have to go. But it's not just about him. It's about setting a precedent that no one is above accountability, no one is immune to the standards we're setting." Maria nodded again, her expression thoughtful. "Understood." As Elaine looked at the papers on her desk, the weight of the battle ahead pressed on her. But she didn't flinch. This was what she had signed up for, the challenge of transforming an entire corporate culture. The fight was never going to be easy, and in fact, it would likely get messier before it got better. But she was prepared. She had always been prepared. That afternoon, Elaine met with the heads of HR and corporate training. The conversation that followed was intense, but it was also necessary. As she laid out the roadmap for the changes she wanted to see, she could feel the pushback, the hesitation in the room. But she also sensed something else, a shift, however small, a dawning realization that they could no longer afford to ignore the pressing need for reform. "We need to make diversity and inclusion a core part of our company's DNA," Elaine said, her voice firm as she addressed the HR head, Marissa Wells, a middle-aged woman who had been with the airline for nearly 20 years. "It can't just be a box we check off during an annual training session. It needs to be present in every hiring decision, every promotion, every interaction between employees." Marissa shifted in her seat. "I understand, Elaine, but you know as well as I do that changing company culture is a long-term process. You can't just snap your fingers and expect the results. There are people, some in leadership positions, who aren't going to take kindly to these changes." Elaine met her gaze steadily. "That's exactly why we need to move forward quickly. The longer we wait, the more entrenched those biases will become. We need a comprehensive diversity training program, and we need it rolled out across the company, immediately. Not just to satisfy any regulations, but because it's the right thing to do." Marissa nodded slowly. "You're right. But this won't be easy. Resistance is inevitable." Elaine wasn't deterred. "I'm not here to make things easy. I'm here to make them better. This airline has the potential to be a leader in more than just the travel industry. We can lead the way in inclusivity, in diversity, in creating an environment where everyone has an equal shot. We need to embrace that." The meeting stretched on for hours, diving deep into every aspect of the company's structure. There were discussions about how to integrate diversity metrics into recruitment, how to create mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, and how to ensure that bias didn't play a role in performance reviews or promotions. By the end of the session, the plan was in motion, and a sense of resolve had settled over the room. But even as Elaine felt a sense of accomplishment, she knew this was only the beginning. The real work was in the execution, in taking these ideas and transforming them into a tangible culture shift that would permeate every level of the organization. And along the way, she would have to face those who resisted, who fought to keep the status quo in place. One thing was certain, Elaine Monroe wasn't just fighting for her own position. She was fighting for something much bigger. And this battle was one she was determined to win. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. As the diversity and inclusion training began to roll out across the company, Elaine found herself at the center of a storm. There were murmurs, quiet resistance from some of the senior leadership, but also growing support from younger executives and employees who had longed for change. Word spread throughout the company about the flight manager's actions, and his refusal to acknowledge her right to access the VIP lounge became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Elaine wasn't just tackling the problem of one biased employee, she was dismantling an entire system that had allowed bias to flourish unchecked. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but as she walked into the office each day, she could feel the winds of change stirring, a force that could no longer be ignored. The battle was on, but Elaine was ready. She had fought too hard for too long to let this moment slip away. The fight for equality, for justice, had stepped into the boardroom, and it was only just beginning. The battle unfolds. The weeks that followed were nothing short of a war. Elaine Monroe had stirred the hornet's nest, and the swarm was coming for her. The once dominant, quiet corridors of the company's headquarters were now filled with tension. The energy in the air was almost palpable, like the calm before a storm. It was as though every employee was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Elaine's inbox flooded with messages of support and criticism in equal measure. Her inbox contained everything from congratulatory notes from middle management to veiled threats from senior leadership. In the moments of solitude between the boardroom meetings and the endless cascade of emails, Elaine reflected on the crossroads at which she now stood. She had always known that leadership would be a lonely place, she had been warned of it. But now, in the thick of it, the reality of the isolation was something she hadn't fully understood until now. The pushback wasn't just from the flight manager who had refused her entry to the VIP lounge. It wasn't just from a disgruntled few. It was systemic. It was deeply embedded within the very fabric of the company. The diversity initiative that Elaine had set into motion was now facing its first serious hurdle, the growing opposition from the board of directors. Some members had begun to question the direction she was taking, framing her push for inclusivity as a distraction from the airline's bottom line. They argued that these efforts could alienate long-time customers, particularly those who had come to expect a certain kind of atmosphere in the airline's premium offerings. Elaine had been anticipating this kind of resistance, but the words still stung. She had spent decades proving her worth to these very individuals, and now, as the company's first black female CEO, they were questioning her judgment. They saw her as a threat to the status quo they had built, to the comfort they had known for so long. She wasn't just rocking the boat, she was threatening to capsize it. Her next board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, and Elaine knew that this would be the pivotal moment. The next steps could either solidify her position or lead to her downfall. She couldn't afford to be passive. Her decision-making had to be bold, unflinching, and strategic. There was too much at stake. But before that, there was another task she had to attend to, the flight manager. His complaint was still unresolved, and though the wheels of investigation were turning, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were a symbol of something far bigger, a microcosm of a culture that had been allowed to fester for far too long. This wasn't just about holding one employee accountable. This was about sending a clear, unambiguous message to the entire company that there would be no tolerance for discrimination in any form. Elaine decided that the best way to handle the flight manager's complaint was to make an example of him, not just for his actions, but for what he represented. She arranged a private meeting with Marissa Wells, the head of HR, and together, they laid the groundwork for what would be a public disciplinary action. This wasn't going to be a quiet internal matter. It would be a statement. In the following days, the flight manager, whose name was Richard Thompson, was placed on indefinite suspension. He would be undergoing mandatory sensitivity training, and his return to work would depend on the results of his performance evaluation. It was clear to Elaine that Richard had taken a deep offense to her leadership, but that would not shield him from the consequences of his actions. It was time for the company to take a hard look at its internal structures and at the attitudes that allowed such blatant displays of ignorance to persist. When the news broke within the company, reactions were mixed. Some employees saw it as a victory, an indication that the leadership would no longer tolerate biases. Others saw it as a political move, a way for Elaine to appease the public and assert her authority. But for Elaine, the issue was always larger than one man. She couldn't allow the incident to be dismissed as a minor mistake or a miscommunication. This was a moment for the company to demonstrate that it was serious about the change Elaine was pushing. And yet, despite the flurry of actions she was taking, Elaine knew she couldn't afford to let her focus waver. She was preparing for the board meeting, and every move she made needed to be calculated. The confrontation was inevitable. It wasn't just about diversity training or making sure employees felt valued, it was about redefining what success in the company truly meant. The day of the board meeting arrived, and Elaine entered the sleek, polished conference room with a sense of steely determination. The heavy glass doors swung open, and the room fell silent as the board members looked up from their papers and phones. They weren't expecting the storm that was about to hit. Elaine didn't waste any time. She stood at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her voice calm but resolute as she began. Ladies and gentlemen, today we discuss more than just numbers or projections. We are discussing the future of this company, the culture we want to create, the values we want to uphold, and the legacy we want to leave behind. I won't apologize for the direction I am taking this company in. The work we are doing to foster inclusivity is not a side project, it is central to our mission. She paused, making eye contact with each member of the board. There were a few uncomfortable shifts in their seats, but she pressed on. The situation with the flight manager was not an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a larger problem within this company, one that we have tolerated for far too long. And I will not stand by while we continue to perpetuate these systems of discrimination. One board member, a man in his late 50s named Gregory Carlisle, cleared his throat. Elaine, we appreciate the passion you're showing, but we have to think about the broader picture. Our primary responsibility is to our shareholders. We can't afford to alienate our most loyal customers with this agenda. Diversity initiatives are all well and good, but they shouldn't come at the cost of profitability. Elaine looked at Gregory for a long moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. She had prepared for this. The arguments about profitability, about maintaining customer loyalty, were old and predictable. She had expected them from the very beginning. But she wasn't going to back down. Gregory, I understand your concern, Elaine began, but let me make one thing clear, diversity is not a side project. It is a business imperative. Studies have shown that companies with diverse leadership are more innovative, more profitable, and better at connecting with their customers. We are in a position to lead this industry in more than just the quality of our flights. We can lead the industry in creating a culture where employees and customers alike feel valued. We can make this company an example of what true, authentic leadership looks like. The room was quiet. Some of the board members looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. But others, those who had supported her from the beginning, nodded in agreement. Elaine could feel the momentum shifting. This wasn't just her fight anymore. She was no longer alone. I'm not asking for your approval, Elaine continued, her voice unwavering. I'm demanding it. The future of this company is one of inclusion, and if you're not willing to be a part of that future, then we will have to part ways. The tension in the room was thick. Gregory Carlisle looked as though he had been slapped. But he held his ground, as if weighing his next words carefully. You know, this isn't just about you and your vision, Elaine, he said slowly. It's about the entire company. You'll need the backing of the board if you want to move forward. Elaine met his gaze with unyielding confidence. Then I suggest you back me fully, because we're going forward, with or without you. The board meeting stretched on for hours, but the battle lines had already been drawn. Elaine had made her position clear. Now, it was up to the board members to decide whether they would stand with her, or let the company crumble under the weight of outdated ideals. For Elaine, the fight for equality had finally reached the heart of the company. But this was only the beginning. What came next would determine not only her future, but the future of every employee who had ever felt invisible within the walls of the company. The real work had just begun. The tipping point. Elaine Monroe's resolve had set a powerful chain of events into motion. The board meeting had ended with tension still hanging in the air, but it had also solidified one thing: the battle for the company's soul was far from over. The hard truth was that her leadership wasn't universally embraced, and those who had spent years at the top of the corporate ladder weren't going to cede their power easily. She had anticipated resistance, but now she understood that this wasn't just a corporate disagreement, it was a personal challenge to the very systems that had kept certain people in power for generations. In the days that followed, the board remained divided. Some members, notably those who had supported her diversity and inclusion initiatives from the start, rallied behind her. They continued to advocate for her leadership, reminding others of the necessity of change in order to stay relevant in a rapidly changing world. But for others, the cost of that change seemed too high, and they quietly began seeking alternatives to the path Elaine had set forth. While the board's political landscape was shifting beneath her feet, Elaine focused her energy on the next critical phase of her plan: transforming the company's culture. She knew that even if the board didn't fully embrace her vision yet, the employees had begun to rally behind her. This was the moment to shift the focus away from her own personal struggle and onto something bigger: the future of the company itself. Elaine began hosting open forums with employees, town hall meetings where everyone, from junior staff to department heads, could voice their opinions and share their ideas. It was, in many ways, a symbolic act, a chance to show the company that this transformation was a collective effort, not something dictated from the top down. She wanted to make sure the employees knew they weren't just spectators in this fight, they were the driving force. One particular session stuck with her. It was held in the company's sleek, glass-walled atrium, a space designed to convey openness and transparency. The air felt heavy as employees filled the rows of chairs, each of them eager to participate, unsure of what was to come. Elaine stood at the front, with a calm but firm presence, addressing the room. "I've heard some of you ask what change really means," she began, her voice steady. "Is it about numbers? Is it about quotas? Or is it about something more fundamental? The answer is simple. Change means that everyone in this company, no matter their background, will feel as though they truly belong here. That's the core of everything we're doing. It's not just about making the workplace more comfortable, it's about making sure it's fair. It's about creating a company culture where all voices are heard and respected." As Elaine spoke, she could see the shift happening before her eyes. The employees were listening, not just to the words, but to the sentiment behind them. They were no longer passive observers. They were beginning to see themselves as part of the solution, as critical players in the vision she was painting for the company's future. Among the crowd was Taylor Foster, a middle manager who had been with the company for over 10 years. Taylor was known for her sharp intellect and quiet demeanor, but she was also one of the first to express frustration when Elaine's leadership was questioned by senior executives. Taylor had faced her own battles. Being the only woman of color in her department for years, she understood the nuances of corporate exclusion more than most. She had seen firsthand how women and minorities were often sidelined in key decisions and promotions. When the flight manager incident happened, she saw it not as an isolated incident, but as a painful reminder of the subtle yet pervasive biases that still existed. As the meeting continued, Taylor raised her hand. Elaine acknowledged her immediately, and she stood up, her voice steady but passionate. "I want to thank you, Elaine," Taylor said, her words carrying across the room. "Thank you for giving us a voice. For too long, many of us have felt like we were just here to fill a seat, to check off a box, but never to truly belong. You're showing us that this company can be better. It has to be better. We deserve more than just acknowledgement, we deserve respect." The room went quiet for a moment. Taylor's words hung in the air like a challenge, a reminder of the reality that many employees had faced for years. This wasn't just about statistics or diversity reports, it was about a fundamental shift in how people were treated. It was about acknowledging the humanity in each employee and ensuring that they could thrive, not just survive, in the workplace. Elaine nodded, a look of quiet pride crossing her face. "Thank you, Taylor," she said. "Your voice matters. All of your voices matter. And we're going to make sure that they are heard." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was heartfelt. There was something in the air now, a spark of hope. The employees knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time, they felt a sense of ownership in the change that was coming. Meanwhile, the resistance within the boardroom was mounting. A few key members, led by Gregory Carlisle, had begun rallying behind an alternative candidate to replace Elaine as CEO. They saw her leadership as too bold, too disruptive, too risky for the company's bottom line. They were concerned about the backlash from their most influential clients, who had been vocal about their displeasure with the changes Elaine was pushing through. Some of these clients, primarily large corporate clients who booked extensive business-class flights, had begun to express concerns that the company's new diversity initiatives would dilute the premium experience they had come to expect. The opposition within the board didn't take long to escalate. Rumors began to circulate that a vote of no confidence was being organized. The moment was approaching, Elaine could feel it in her bones. She knew that this battle for the company's future would not be won in one meeting or with one speech. It would take more than that. It would take a full commitment from every level of the company, from the janitorial staff to the boardroom. Elaine decided to call an emergency board meeting, one that would force the hand of her detractors. She wasn't just going to wait for them to take action. She was going to make her own moves, to push the conversation forward and take control of her destiny. It wasn't just about saving her job, it was about saving the vision she had for this company, the future she saw for its employees, and the new values she had been fighting for. The meeting was set for the following Thursday morning. Elaine didn't sleep much the night before, but as dawn broke and she prepared to face the board, she felt something shift within her. She wasn't afraid. She was beyond fear now. This was her fight, and it was the only one that truly mattered. In the meeting, the room was even more charged than before. The board members were on edge, sensing that this would be a defining moment. Gregory stood up first, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Elaine, we can't keep moving forward with this agenda," he began. "You're jeopardizing the company's core values. We've received numerous complaints from clients and senior managers who are uncomfortable with the direction you're taking us. There's no room for more diversity quotas at this stage in our business." Elaine took a deep breath, staring directly at him. Her response was calm, but her words carried weight. "I've heard your concerns, Gregory, and I understand them. But let's be clear. The direction I'm taking this company isn't about quotas. It's about values. It's about ensuring that we are creating a future that is representative of the world we operate in, not the one we used to live in. And that world, this company, will be stronger, more innovative, and more profitable because of it. We will no longer sacrifice our future for the comfort of the past." The room went silent. For the first time in weeks, there was a shift in the air. It wasn't a complete victory, not yet. But in that moment, Elaine knew that she had taken the first real step toward changing not just the company, but the entire corporate culture. The battle was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. Elaine was no longer just fighting for her vision. She was fighting for the very essence of who the company was becoming, and she was ready to lead it into a new future, one that was more inclusive, more compassionate, and far more powerful than anything they had known before. The tipping point had arrived at a new era. The following weeks felt like an unyielding wave, pushing Elaine forward with unrelenting force. Each day seemed to bring new challenges, yet with each challenge came new opportunities to solidify the vision she had worked so hard to bring to life. The battle within the boardroom had reached a fever pitch, and the tension was so thick it felt as if the company's very foundation could crack at any moment. But with every pushback, every whisper behind closed doors, Elaine grew stronger. She knew that every battle fought was a battle won, not in the sense of immediate victory, but in the sense of paving the way for a future that would reflect her values, and those of so many others who had been sidelined for far too long. Elaine's mornings had become more routine. They began with a cup of freshly brewed coffee in her hands and a steady rhythm of emails and meetings. But underneath the routine, the pressure of the board's looming decision weighed heavily on her mind. There had been no clear winner in the battle for her position, at least not yet. Though the public-facing side of the company seemed more unified in support of her leadership, the quiet scheming in the background was far from over. One morning, as Elaine stepped into the sleek, glass-lined boardroom for another critical meeting with the full board, she sensed something was different. The energy in the room felt shifted. The heavy silence that had marked previous meetings had been replaced by an undertone of uneasy anticipation. She took her seat at the head of the table, her usual confidence now tempered with a mixture of wariness and calculated purpose. This meeting would either solidify her as the unchallenged leader of the company, or it would be the final act before her departure. As the room settled into quiet murmurs, Gregory Carlyle stood. He was one of the loudest critics of her leadership, someone who had spent years at the top of the company and had made no secret of his discomfort with the changes she was championing. But today, there was a flicker of something different in his eyes. There was a begrudging respect. He cleared his throat and, for the first time in many weeks, spoke in a tone that wasn't dripping with disdain. "Elaine," Gregory began, his voice strong but not as harsh as before, "I've always respected your drive and your dedication to this company. I think, if anything, we all can agree that you've brought an energy to this place that hasn't been seen in years. But leadership isn't just about pushing through ideas, it's about bringing the team along with you, creating a space where everyone feels invested in the same vision. And the truth is, there are still many who aren't on board with what you're trying to do." Elaine knew Gregory wasn't backing down. He was a skilled manipulator, and though his words were crafted to sound like a critique, there was an underlying challenge within them. He was testing her resolve, trying to gauge whether she would continue her fight. But Elaine had heard it all before. She had listened to countless doubts, witnessed the board's wavering support, and weathered the storm of growing opposition. She wasn't the same woman who had first stepped into this role, unsure and uncertain. She had come too far to be shaken by Gregory's tactics. "I understand your concerns, Gregory," Elaine responded, her voice unwavering. "But let me be clear, this company is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who has worked here, from the newest hire to the senior executives. My role is not to dictate change, it's to facilitate it, to ensure that the change is meaningful and lasting. If there are members of this board who believe that our diversity initiatives are a distraction, or that inclusivity isn't integral to our growth, I'd suggest they take a long, hard look at where the world is heading." The room was silent, but Elaine could feel the shift within it. Some of the board members exchanged glances, clearly uneasy, while others seemed to lean into her words, their resolve visibly strengthening. They were no longer looking at her as a challenger to their power but as a leader who was pushing them into uncharted waters, and perhaps, they were beginning to see the potential for growth that she was offering. Before anyone could speak again, Elaine took a deep breath and turned to Marissa Wells, the head of HR, who had been instrumental in helping her shape the company's new initiatives. "Marissa, please share with us the results of the latest employee feedback," she said. Marissa, who had been quietly supportive of Elaine throughout the past few months, nodded and stood up. With a click of her remote, she displayed a slide on the screen in front of the room. The data was overwhelming. It showed a sharp increase in employee satisfaction across all departments, particularly among the company's underrepresented groups. The survey results revealed that employees felt heard, supported, and more confident in their future at the company. There had also been a marked rise in productivity and innovation in departments where diversity was prioritized. The figures on the screen spoke for themselves, and though the board members had expected the numbers to be favorable, they hadn't anticipated such a strong case for Elaine's approach. It was one thing to talk about change, it was another to show that change was already working. Elaine had given them a glimpse of what the company could become. Now, there was no turning back. We've seen a 30% increase in employee retention among our diverse teams, Marissa continued, her voice confident as she went through the data. And across departments, innovation has increased by 18%. Our creative teams have developed new strategies that are already being rolled out. The work is not just a nice to have, it's a driving force in this company's future. Elaine watched as the board members absorbed the information. She could see the cracks in their resistance, the moments when the old guard of the company began to realize they had underestimated the power of inclusivity. This wasn't just a passing trend, it was the future of the company, and they had to accept it. After a few moments of quiet deliberation, Gregory Carlisle spoke again, but this time his voice held a different tone. Elaine, he said slowly, I'll admit that I've been wrong about some things. I didn't see the full picture. But the numbers don't lie. I can't deny what's happening. And I think the rest of the board needs to understand that this isn't just about diversity, it's about survival. We're at a crossroads, and we need leadership that can guide us into the future. Elaine's heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for, when the weight of her vision would finally begin to sink in for those who had doubted her. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was close enough that she could almost taste it. With a firm nod, Elaine stood up from her seat, the room falling silent once more. I didn't ask for anyone's approval when I began this journey. But I'm not here to just survive, I'm here to make this company thrive. And if that means challenging the status quo, so be it. Change is never easy, but it's the only way forward. Her words hung in the air as the board members exchanged glances. One by one, they began to nod, and for the first time since she had taken over the role of CEO, Elaine felt the weight of their support. This was the beginning of something new, something transformative. The battle for the company's future was far from over, but with each passing day, Elaine knew that she was no longer alone. The tides had turned, and the storm she had weathered had only made her stronger. The company's future was now in her hands, and she wasn't about to let go. As the meeting concluded, there was a palpable shift in the room. For the first time, the board wasn't just discussing Elaine's leadership, they were acknowledging the necessity of the path she was forging. The old guard had been pushed aside, replaced by the undeniable force of a woman who was changing the rules of the game, one step at a time. Elaine Monroe had finally become the leader her company, and the world, needed. She had fought for her vision, and in doing so, she had reshaped the future of the airline industry itself. Now, more than ever, she was ready to take the next step, guiding her company into a new era, one of equality, innovation, and limitless potential.